Professor von Trotter and staff members of ZAC, KIT, and the City of Karlsruhe. Thank you very much for having us here. We really do appreciate it. And it's very nice to be able to indulge in your exercise of public science. Of all of us in academia think that we're reaching the public, but we know we're not. So to be presented with an opportunity where we're actually going to indulge in public science is intimidating, but I'll try to do my best. But thank you again for having me and having all of us over here. I'm going to speak to you about overcoming cultural distances. Listening yesterday to the music as well as the keynote speech reminded us all of how, as a humanity, every now and then, once we are defeated, once we are lying low, once we have fought great wars, out of those emerge some great initiatives. And then we look back on those and sometimes we say we didn't do too well, we tried. And I'm going to speak to one of those initiatives today, which was the initiative of having global institutions shape international development. And this would be an initiative in the post-war era that would bring together organizations like the World Bank, UNESCO, or the British Council, the Goethe Institute, all of these organizations around the world, which would bring people together in imagining the way that the global south perhaps could be better off. And I'm going to speak to here where we might have succeeded and where we might not have succeeded. So what was the way in which we thought about development? Mostly the following. The developing world was going to catch up. And who was it going to catch up with? It was going to catch up with the West. And what did that catching up entail? It entailed mostly two things in an economic sense. One was that it would be industrialized, because after all, Germany had been industrialized, England had been industrialized, Europe had been industrialized, the United States had been industrialized, so the way to develop was to industrialize. So the way we would think about these development experiences would be, how do we industrialize? And the second one would be that we would exchange our goods with each other. That was trade. Europe had gone through the era of trade and paused between 1914 and 1945, but then we would create post-war institutions, the predecessor of the World Trade Organization, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, and that would help the world trade, and the developing world would catch up and start to trade as well. So in other words, to summarize, the development imaginary, the cultural imaginary was the following. It was the way that development had taken place or had been imagined to take place in Europe and the West, and the developing world would be told to do the same. Or there were people in the developing world who wanted to do the same. So that's what I am going to be talking about today. Have we traveled along that cultural distance, and how well have we fared? I'm going to give you a good story and perhaps a not so good story here, though I'll be telling several, but keep this main story in mind as I go through it. All sorts of narratives comes with rituals and symbols. So this is a story we're telling the world. This is how you need to be developed, and we tell these stories with symbols. We tell them with rituals. So what were those rituals? I'm going to suggest to you that a lot of those rituals were those that came out of the West. And part of our exercise in thinking about the North and the South has been to tell a more inclusive story. So the good story I'm going to tell you at the end is going to be about how well have we done in incorporating symbols that weren't just from here, which may be from somewhere else, to tell a story that might be different. This is a lot of stuff. I'm an academic, and but I won't take you through all of this. But the stories I'm telling here are, how did these stories play out in terms of these international institutions that we created in the post-war era, at the World Bank, or what is now known as the United Nations Development Program, or at the World Trade Organization, or UNESCO. Let me start first with UNESCO. This was perhaps the most poignant endeavor on the part of all of us as humanity to put together something which would make us reflect on what we had done between World War I and World War II, or as World War I and World War II were continuing. UNESCO starts with a preamble that since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the seeds of peace must be created. It was a way to think about culture and to think about the fact that all of what we do starts within the space between our ears, in terms of the way that we interact with each other. That's where culture eventually lies. It's the way we think about the world. So UNESCO was going to think about the world differently and foster a culture of peace. It was a universal humanistic sort of an endeavor, very broad. On the other hand, World Trade Organization, another post-war institution, comes out doing something totally different but related to it. It's related because it's also about how we exchange things with each other. There is a lot of political thought which tells us that if we exchange goods with each other, we won't fight with each other. That's the liberal theory of peace lying in trade. In that sense, UNESCO and World Trade Organization are related. If I export goods to you, you export goods to me, because we are an interdependent relationship, we would get along with each other. So whether it was the World Trade Organization or it was UNESCO, all of us were thinking of a world in which we would be co-joined in our endeavors. How well did we do? I'm going to suggest to you that we didn't do so well when it comes to UNESCO. It was a heroic endeavor, but we really have not figured out what would it mean to have a culture of peace where we start thinking differently about the world. And the reason that UNESCO was so unsuccessful, I would argue, is not because we didn't put our best foot forward, but we didn't put our best resources forward. We hadn't quite figured out how to lend those resources to thinking about that culture of peace, or what would it mean. UNESCO, its annual budget is right now about $300 million, which is probably less than the budget of KIT, although I haven't checked. But I would imagine that most universities have a budget of about $1 billion each, and here we're trying to bring forth a culture of peace in the world with $300 million a year. So just in terms of resource constraint, that's huge. And then to bring together the world's powers to speak of that culture of peace, who would they bring together? They would bring together people like you and me, the elite of the world, to speak to the culture of peace, and that's just not going to work out. So what I have here is a quote from Richard Hoggart, who was the Assistant Director General of UNESCO at one time, and he's speaking to how UNESCO, what you find there is not a culture of peace, but the fact that you find the world's nations really sort of fighting it out with each other. And he says, every now and then, however, we are reminded of what UNESCO is all about. And he says, one of those moments was when Pablo Neruda, the poet, stood in front of the General Assembly and he evoked what it meant to be poor in the world. He represented their condition. And it was as if, he says, the poor of his native Chile walked behind him. So in some ways, when we tell these stories of the world in elite gatherings like this, or in UNESCO, or at the World Bank, or at the World Trade Organization, we have to think about who is being represented and who is doing the representation. And whose story is getting represented. The success story of UNESCO, if any, lies in the fact that it tried to represent the world. But the best it could do was to have a Pablo Neruda in frail health, reminding them of what it would be like if we really did so. I'm going to leave the UNESCO story there and then move on to a book that I wrote called Sweet Talk. And this is about the story being told from the World Trade Organization. And the Sweet Talk, the title comes from the following. We talk very sweet to the developing world and say, don't you want to send us your goods? Don't you want to trade with the world? Be our equal. And the moment they try to do so, we put tariff barriers. Okay. So let me give you one little example. These tariff barriers are the following. If you are in the developing world and you export a primary commodity, it's copper, zinc, cotton, etc., then the tariff, actually not cotton, copper, zinc more than cotton, tariff barriers would be 0%, 0.2%. The moment you make it into a copper wire, the tariff barriers are higher. They're known as tariff differentials. In other words, we're going to keep them in the place of producing primary commodities and not let them have that industrialization, which we told them they must have in order to be developed. So structurally, you're stuck. You're in a system which tells you you must export, but the moment those exports leave the country, the barriers begin to go up if they've been processed, if they've gone up the value chain. And those tariff differentials are one of the main things that the global south was talking about in the 1950s and the 60s and the 70s when the world trading system began to work. But we talked very sweetly to them. We want you to be developed. We want you to exchange with us. Here's monies for you to develop. What they wanted was reciprocity in trade. Give us the tariff concessions. When you go back into the archives and look at what was going on in Havana when the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade was created, which is a world trading order in the post-war era, the developing world wanted reciprocity. The developed world wanted to give them preferences because at that time the colonizing powers of Europe had imperial preferences with the colonies. These concessions which were given just to the colonies. So Britain had its concessions to its colonies, France had its concessions to its own colonies, etc. And those preferences are the ones which showed up in the global North-South order. So from the top, it looks like a very nice story to be told to the world. Come and trade with us and we will give you reciprocity. But when you look in the technical details, the developing world was forever going to be kept in the position of being a primary producer, never getting to a place where they could be industrialized. I wanted to jump forth in your mind. Imagine if the developing world does industrialize and starts to produce commodities which start to compete then with Europe or with America. You would imagine that people who wanted to keep them perpetually in that state of having a begging bowl in hand would then say, how dare you take our jobs now? How dare you start to compete with us? How dare you cross frontiers that we told you not to cross? I'll leave it to you to figure out if we've reached there or we haven't. I'll also give you some empirical analysis here of this discourse that I'm calling, by the way, the patronizing discourse that came from the developed world in places like the World Trade Organization. What this discourse meant was, we want you to stay there and we will discriminate against you. But it was a very sweet-sounding discourse. It was a very sweet-sounding story. And what I'm going to give you is some empirical analysis of where you might be able to find that paternalism, which to me is kind of the post-war equivalent of that colonialism. How would you study it empirically? Because it's nice of me to say that, and you can see I'm from the global south somewhere, and I'm sure you've imagined, and say, okay, fine, he comes in here, he says these things, and he goes away. We've heard it before. I better provide you with some evidence for where would you try to find it. And I'm going to skip through a few slides here on where would you find it. Here's one picture where you would find it. You would imagine that the developing world would be very good at producing agricultural commodities, and that's what they would export. What this figure is showing you is all the countries which get development assistance get no agricultural concessions. It's what we would call a perfect hyperbola. We will give you foreign aid, but we won't give you concessions, tariff concessions in agriculture. It shows up over and over again. So the developing world which wants to export cotton or wants to export sugar, soya beans, rice, they just cannot do so. Instead we say, here's foreign aid for you. Sweet-sounding foreign aid, which basically says, in the Brazil case, which is a very famous case in cotton, Brazil was eventually given $300 million to set up a cotton institute to improve its capacity in cotton. From the perspective of the West, that's going to sound very nice. $300 million to set up a cotton institute. What they wanted was tariff concessions because they can already produce cotton. They don't need a cotton production institute. You know, it's like a country being told, this is money for toothpaste factory when they already produce toothpaste. You know, what are you going to do with that? So that's what I mean by that paternalism discourse and how it plays out. And I've just given you the story in terms of agriculture. Here's a story that I put together from the press releases from the United States Trade Representative's Office from 1982 to 1993. And I obtained these from a Freedom of Information Act request, and I coded all of those press releases for what was the sentiment of the United States towards the developing world. How was the developing world referred to in the press releases? Was it a favorable impression? Was it an unfavorable impression? Or was it a paternalistic discourse, which I've already told you is a narrative which is treating the the developing world like an infant and asking the infant to grow up. So I coded all of those 13 years of press releases. This is the same period that we had what was known as the Uruguay round of world trade, which was to break down the tariff barriers among countries. And what I find is that 93% of the paternalistic references in those press releases in the 13-year period were towards the developing world. Only 7% from the United States were towards what we would call the OECD countries. And those 7% included countries in press releases where the developing world was being referred to. They're known as GSP provisions. I won't go into the technicalities of it, but if it was by an accident that even though 7% of the countries were referred to in a paternal. So over and over again, what you find is in the 13-year period, the developing world is being talked about in a different fashion than the developed world. So then you can say, well, what difference does it make? We can talk about some people in a bad fashion, but we can still do good things for them. What I've shown you in the previous slide is we didn't. We also did not give them agricultural concessions. But if you ask most people in the developed world today, how much have you done for the developing world? Mostly the discourse you will hear on the street, and I know I'm being provocative here, would be, look how much we've done for them. And those ungrateful people, when they come here, look what they do. And that's our cultural discontent today. And that's where I liked the Tim Snyder speech, because it reminded us that actually we didn't bury our demons. It sounded like a very nice global liberal order, but in that liberal order, the bottom 3 billion of the world didn't get much. And when they tried to, we're even more hostile towards them right now because of that sweet talk that we did in the past, where we said, look, here's what we're doing for you. I won't actually go through these empirical results here, but I have lots and lots of regression results which show over and over again that the developing world gets discriminated against. So I won't run through, I just have them, I can turn back to them later on, but I've tested for this across all sorts of issue areas, whether it's agriculture, manufacturing, services, intellectual property, and over again, when the developing world fights very hard and gets very small concessions, they're portrayed as having been given to inferior countries and through some kind of a gift from the West. Okay? And in the end, they don't amount to much. So let me move now. So this is the bad story that I'm telling. In other words, developing world is stuck at places like the World Trade Organization. They're never going to get there. They're just going to be left, they're structurally fixed to be primary producers, and even in those primary producers like cotton, etc., they're going to face all kinds of trade barriers. So is there a way out of this? And the narrative that I'm going to give you now is one of the World Bank. World Bank is a body that, at least in the little culture in which I work, academia, is much maligned. It's this neoliberal organization which is going to tell the developing world what to do, and they just don't have their incentives right. And so the World Bank story that I'm going to tell you over here is slightly different. I only have about 3 minutes left, so it's going to be a very fast story. And the story is the following, that I've been doing some research on where exactly do World Bank projects succeed. The way that we have brought forward this narrative of development in the World Bank and other places, not just World Bank, but UNDP and a number of other organizations, is that if people participated in the projects that impact their lives, and if they were able to design those projects, that they would look very different, that they would have a better impact on their lives than if they didn't. And what I've been able to find, and so also many other researchers have been able to find, is that if those projects speak to their lives in a way in which it makes their economic lives better off, but they're also able to design them themselves, that it might have a greater impact. So that's the summary of where I'm going to take you, and here are some of the empirical results, and I'm going to go forth. And I know this figure will not make sense to you immediately as you see it unless you have a very technical background, but I'll explain it to you. What it's showing is the following. This is my research done on all of the projects from World Bank in a particular sector. And I picked out information communication technology sector for a number of reasons, but because we believe that technologies are more participatory, they involve people. So if World Bank projects are going to succeed in something in involving people, it'll be this particular sector. And what this figure is showing you is the following. When projects include economic incentives for people to better their conditions, not economic incentives in forms of foreign aid, economic incentives to earn a living. When projects include economic incentives, and when we involve in those projects civil society, businesses, governments, consultants, NGOs, when more and more actors are involved, and when the projects have economic incentives built in them, those projects are very likely to be successful. What does this have to do with the other narrative that I mentioned in the World Trade Organization? In the World Trade Organization, you want economic incentives to be able to export cotton, or to be able to export sugar, or to be able to export soybeans, or textiles, or garments, but you face a wall. The projects I'm talking about here are projects at a very micro level. So in a way, this is the more optimistic story I'm telling from World Bank projects. If World Bank can do it, so can other organizations, because World Bank is the body that we attack so often for not understanding people's lives. And I found that in these World Bank projects, those which had those incentives and those which involved society in a comprehensive fashion were very likely to be successful. So what are my major findings? My major findings are that participation does matter. And international organizations, when they foster participation, are very likely to put forth a cultural narrative that speaks to people's lives. And what I've told you is UNESCO tried, but it just didn't, because it stayed very elitist. World Trade Organization has the instruments where it could make a difference in people's lives, but there are power barriers. So instead, what we are left with is a development imaginary which speaks to the participation of people. I think that's another story which can be recovered in European history too. Europe didn't develop because there was a strong state or somebody gave Europe foreign assistance. Europe developed through the initiative of a lot of people working on the ground, through its small-scale industry, through its medium-scale industry, through its research institutions, and there was a cultural learning that took place along the way which allowed Europe to cross those frontiers. And so the story I've told you here, in that sense, is a European story too, but with a difference. It's a story in which we'll have to stop talking really sweetly. It's a story in which we would have to stop talking about the fact that when they come here, they're so ungrateful. But instead, it's a story of reciprocity, of looking within ourselves and saying, what does it mean really to be equal in this world? And for me, that is perhaps the most important responsibility we have in the 21st century. Thank you very much.